These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? Adding a mate threat to create an overworked piece. Mostly we have concerned ourselves so far in this chapter with cases where an enemy piece is guarding two sensitive points on the board in front of you. But it also is possible to create an overworked piece. You see an enemy piece guarding against mate, so you build an additional mate threat on another square it also protects. It becomes stretched too thin, and then one of the threats works or you win material that your opponent has to sacrifice to save the game. In this first example you see that you, playing the black pieces, have a queen close enough to white's king to menace it. Think more precisely about how it could become a mate threat. If the queen had a supporter attacking h2 or g2, it could mate there. Black could furnish such support with rook moves to e2. The rook on e1 obviously seems to prevent such a move, but hold that thought anyway. Now notice that since the king is cornered, black also has the makings of mate with queen takes rook f1. This, too, is prevented by the rook on e1. Aha, the e1 rook can be overworked, it guards, or will guard, against two mating threats. So you go ahead with rook moves to e2, which results in mate one way or another. A. If white plays rook takes rook, black plays queen takes rook f1 hashtag. B. If white for some reason plays rook moves to g1, black plays queen takes at h2, checkmate. C. If white plays rook moves to f2, black plays rook takes rook f2, not rook takes rook e1, since then white has bishop takes rook, and now nothing can stop black from mating with his queen on h2. White has a couple of feudal checks on black's back rank that delay matters for a move or two. The e1 rook can be understood as overworked in that it guarded both the mating square f1 and also e2, which was a stepping stone to mate for black and not guarded by anything else. Another way to look at this position is that black creates an overworked enemy defender. The e1 rook was frozen in place because it needed to protect f1. Once black sees this, he takes advantage by sticking a rook next to it and creating a fresh mate threat in the process. White to move. What is the best move? Start by looking at the captures you have the power to make and ask what stops them from working. Here you would like to play queen takes queen but are stopped by black's knight on f5. You can't take the knight, but maybe you can experiment with ways of overworking it since you have other threats pending against black's king. Building a mate threat often is a matter of finding a square next to the enemy king that already is under attack by one of your pieces and then adding another attacker to it. To use the principle to overwork an enemy piece, try planting that second attacker on a square that the enemy piece protects. Here you see that you already have a rook aimed at h7, so you add another with rook moves to h4, a square black's knight defends. Black can't sit still for this, he has to take one of white's rooks to prevent mate. Next move with rook takes at h7, checkmate. His knight is his only piece that attacks either rook, so his best move is to play knight takes rook g7, we will consider his other options in a moment. Now you have queen takes queen, winning a queen for a rook. That's the sequence as it goes with best play by black. But a move like one rook moves to h4 does not force your opponent's reply in the strong sense we see with checks or, sometimes, captures. Black has a couple of other ways he could respond to it, and they all need to be seen and considered. A. Black could play one pawn from h7 moves to h5. No problem, for of course you also see that you have the kernel of a discovery, indeed, a discovered check with your rook and queen. Thus 2. Rook takes at g6, check. And there is nothing black can do to stop you from mating. 2. Queen takes queen, rook takes at h5, check. 3. Knight moves to h6, a feudal interposition, RHXN hashtag. B. Black could play pawn from h7 moves to h6. This seems better because black's pawn has protection from its knight. So now your discovered check doesn't work, rook takes at g6, check. Again is met with 2. Queen takes queen, and this time it won't work to give check with your rook on the h-file because black replies knight takes rook. You would have to simply recapture rook takes queen and then black has knight takes rook h4. But you can do better in reply to 1. Pawn from h7 moves to h6, play 2. Queen moves to f7, and black cannot escape mate, example if 2, knight takes rook g7, 3. Rook takes at h6, checkmate. The best black can do is throw checks at white's king until he is out of them. C. Speaking of checks, black can reply to 1. Rook moves to h4 with knight moves to g3, check. It doesn't work. You come back with 2. King moves to h2. This looks a little scary because you are creating the kernel of a discovered check with black's knight and queen. But black can't take advantage. If he tries knight moves to f5, check. You still play 3. Queen takes queen, knight takes queen, 4. Rook takes at h7, checkmate. The main line of analysis in this position is another example of how an overworked piece can be exploited two ways. If it protects a piece and a square needed to mate, the first thought may be to take the piece, then again, it sometimes works better to play the mating attack, allow it to fail, and then take the enemy piece left vulnerable by those defensive efforts. White to move. What is the best move? You see that white has a standard formation for a mate, his queen is ready to land next to black's king on g7 with protection from his knight. Black's queen prevents this, so white considers what else the black queen is trying to protect and finds the rook on g5. White can take it with rook takes rook, but this won't quite work. Once black recaptures with queen takes rook, his queen still guards g7. What white needs is a capture of a piece that black can't defend without pulling his queen out of reach of g7. The queen guards nothing else, but notice that the pattern might be completed if black's rook could be forced onto a different square. Or if you prefer, simply consider any checks white can give. By either route you find rook moves to h4, check. How is black to reply? White's rook cannot be captured, so black's only choices are to interpose something or move the king. Consider his principal alternatives. A. Black can move his king to g8. When the enemy king moves, ask what checks you would have against it on its new square. Be especially alert to moves by the king that put it on the same color square as your knight if you have one in the neighborhood. Here king moves to g8 is met with knight moves to e7, check. A knight fork that wins the queen. Mate follows a couple of moves later. Or, b. Black can interpose his rook at h5. But now it becomes as good as loose, if white takes it with rook takes rook, check. Black no longer can reply queen takes rook, for white then mates with queen takes at g7. Yet white soon mates anyway, after white plays 2. Rook takes rook, check. Black has to move his king to g8, and now comes the knight fork 3. Knight moves to e7, check. Etc. That sequence is why the position appears in this section. Rook moves to h4 creates a fresh threat of disaster that only black's queen can address, but it already has a mortal threat to worry about at g7. Once black's rook interposes on h5, the black queen thus is overworked in a straightforward sense. It guards a mating square and a rook that both are under attack, and if it recaptures in one place it abandons the defense of the other. Black to move. What is the best move? You should have no trouble seeing that black's queen and knight both attack g2, that black nearly is ready to mate there with queen takes at g2, and that white prevents this with his queen on d2. The question is how you best can take advantage of the constraints this pattern imposes on white's queen. The only thing the queen protects that you can take is the pawn on d4. That would not be a bad gain by itself, but in any event it is not just any pawn. Once black takes it with rook takes at d4, his rook now adds to black's offensive thrust by bearing down directly on white's queen and the rook behind it. So consider white's possible replies to rook takes at d4 and their consequences. A. If he plays queen takes rook, black mates with queen takes at g2. B. White might search for a square where the queen is safe and still protects both g2 and the rook on d1, and so play queen moves to c2. But then black plays rook takes rook d1 plus and mates next move no matter what white does. C. White's best move is to evacuate his queen from d2 and try to take out the mate threat on g2 directly by playing queen takes knight. Black doesn't play queen takes queen now because white's queen still is guarded by his bishop. He plays rook takes rook, check. Winning the exchange and gaining a tempo he can use to keep his own queen safe after white's king is forced to h2. This position could have gone in the next chapter, which covers threats against a guard. Black's rook takes at d4 was an attack on white's queen, which was protecting a mating square. But the position also fits here because of the b line described above. Rook takes at d4 adds a second threat of mate rook takes rook on top of the existing threat of queen takes at g2. White's queen is responsible for preventing both. If white isn't careful, one of the threats will succeed, and even if he is careful he loses material. We see again a standard method for overworking a piece. Observe that it is preventing mate, then make threats on squares that it appears, perhaps deceptively, to be able to guard. White to move. What is the best move? Distracting a rook from duties up the board. Now we consider a single rather common pattern. Sometimes a rook on the back rank will protect a piece that lies somewhere up the board on the same file. This can be a perilous arrangement, because a rook so positioned often is needed as well to protect its king against attacks on the back rank. Such a rook quickly can become overworked. Here we examine this theme and variations on it in some detail. This first diagram presents the point in simplest form. White has the power to capture black's queen with his own, but the black queen has protection from its rook at b8. When you see a piece drawing protection from a rook on the back rank, ask whether you can make trouble elsewhere on the back rank, as with a check like rook moves to c8, check. Black has no flight squares for his king, so his only legal reply is rook takes rook. This leaves his queen loose and so allows white to play queen takes queen. Black's rook was overworked, it protected its queen and also the mating square c8. Notice, of course, that the reverse move order ends in disaster for white, as the black king gets a flight square on g7. Black to move. What is the best move? This position is structurally similar to the first one in this section, though it looks a little different because of the compression of pieces at white's end of the board. Take it apart the same way. Black would like to play queen takes queen, but white's rook on d1 guards the target. Since the queen's defender is on the back rank, test its stability by putting one of your pieces there. Rook moves to b1, check. White's only legal response is rook takes rook, leaving his queen to be taken with queen takes queen. White's d1 rook was overworked. White to move. What is the best move? White has a single capture available with queen takes queen. It's prevented by black's rook on his back rank. White considers dropping one of his own rooks onto that rank, testing whether the black rook there might be overworked. This time black can move his king to g7, an option that, as we shall see, can complicate matters a bit. Here white's recourse is clear enough, though. He then has rook takes rook, and if black replies queen takes rook, white has queen takes queen. Or if black plays queen takes queen, it is met with rook takes queen. The point, once your rook is on the enemy back rank, be broad-minded in thinking about what it might do there. White to move. What is the best move? You look at white's capturing options and see that he would like to play queen takes queen, but to make it rewarding he needs to loosen black's queen first. This he tries to do by adding one of his own rooks to black's back rank with check via rook moves to e8. If black plays rook takes rook, white plays queen takes queen. Again, though, black has the option of moving his king to g7, so now what? Here, unlike in the previous position, playing rook takes rook then ruins everything for white. Black replies rook takes rook, and now his queen has just as much protection as it did at the start. But this position also differs from the prior one because black has a second rook loose on his back rank. So white replies to king moves to g7 with queen takes queen. If black recaptures rook takes queen, now white has rook takes rook a8. In effect black's rook on c8 gets pinned to the other rook when white plays rook moves to e8. It's another example of the same point. Think broadly about what your rook can do once it's on the back rank. White to move. What is the best move? White's queen is loose and is about to get taken by black's queen. White naturally would like to play queen takes queen himself, but at this point it would just trade queens. Better to distract the black queen's guard first with one. Rook moves to c8, check. Black has to play one. Rook takes rook and so leave his queen loose. Time for white to play two. Queen takes queen? Not quite yet, for then black has two. Rook takes rook, check. And ends up with two rooks in return for his queen. No, before white plays queen takes queen he should exploit the priority of check and finish the job on the back rank. He plays two. Rook takes rook, check. Rook takes rook. Now comes queen takes queen, and white has won a queen and a rook for his two rooks. He enters the endgame with a queen against black's rook and should have no trouble winning. The general lesson is not to be hasty in playing a payoff move like queen takes queen. Make sure you have exhausted the damage you can do with checks that hold the initiative, and make sure you have not left your opponent any damage to do. Look at his checks, after you play your concluding capture. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's queen is loose and is about to get taken by white's queen. He can retreat the queen or play queen takes queen, and queen takes queen would be a coup, rather than a wash played for defensive reasons, if he could first get rid of white's rook on a1. He has a way to do this. He can drop a rook to the back rank with rook moves to b1, check. This gains him time. White has to save his king rather than play queen takes queen. But white isn't required to play rook takes rook and then lose his queen. Instead he can move his king to f2. But notice that now white's rook on a1 is attacked twice and defended just once, so black can take it with queen takes rook. If white replies queen takes queen, black then has rook takes queen. It's another example of broad-mindedness on the back rank. If the enemy king moves, maybe there is other damage to be wrought there. But not so fast. Taking white's rook actually is a mistake. Black has better. When the enemy king moves, you religiously want to examine any checks you can give against it in its new position, even if that means interrupting a sequence you plan to play elsewhere. Here one black king moves to f2 for white gives black a new option against the king. 2 queen moves to e1, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? White's queen is loose and under attack, so as usual he considers whether to retreat or take the offensive. He could win black's queen if he first could be rid of the rook that protects it from d8, so of course he thinks about putting one of his own rooks on black's back rank. The trouble is that he can't. His rook on e1 is aimed the right way, but the knight on e4 blocks its path. What to do? Move the knight, and do it violently so as to force black to spend a move making a reply. A check is best, and a fork is best of all, so white plays knight moves to f6, check. Attacking black's king and queen. After black replies pawn from g7 takes knight, the way is clear for white to play the traditional rook moves to e8, check. Black's king has no flight squares, so rook takes rook is compulsory for him. Now white has turned the tables and plays queen takes queen. He has won a queen for a knight and a rook, a favorable trade. Consider it as a matter of points. White converted the 3-point advantage he had at the outset with his extra knight into a 4-point advantage. Now he has a queen and a rook against 2 rooks. Black to move. What is the best move? Black has a possible capture in queen takes rook, but it won't work now because of the protection provided by white's other rook on c1. Black considers rook takes bishop, check, asking whether it would either draw the c1 rook away from guard duty or win the bishop for free. Sure enough, it requires white to play rook takes rook, after which black plays queen takes rook, recovering his rook and netting a piece. By now that much is easy. Yet there is a still stronger sequence. You find it by playing with the alternative move orders available to achieve your aims. This time start with queen takes rook c3. Now white plays rook takes queen, black replies rook takes bishop d1 plus, and since black's rook cannot be captured, white must interpose his queen on f1. Black plays rook takes queen, winning back his queen. After white recaptures king takes rook, what is the net result? Black's gain is the same. He has won a queen, a rook, and a bishop for a queen and a rook. The difference is that here black has traded queens as well as winning a piece of favorable adjustment, since the advantage of an extra piece becomes more meaningful as the number of pieces on the board decreases. That is why the usual goal once you obtain a material advantage is to trade away pieces, simplifying the position to make your advantage loom larger. Better still if you can simplify pieces away during the course of your tactical sequence. The larger point is to remember that there are two ways to proceed if you find an overworked enemy piece. You can, at least in principle, go after either of the targets it protects, whether pieces or squares. Sometimes the right move order is obvious, sometimes it isn't. Here it might seem obvious since the most familiar move order does win a piece, but there is an advantage to taking a second look at the counterintuitive second sequence that leads with a more valuable piece, the queen. Notice, by the way, that if white's king had a flight square, example if his h2 pawn were on h3, the second sequence wouldn't work. White could reply to the rook check at d1 by moving his king rather than by interposing his queen. But the first sequence still would be productive. White to move. What is the best move? White has a battery of queen and rook, and a pawn, too, on the g-file, but let's assume he can't quite find a way to mate with it. So examine the black king more closely and notice that it is completely immobilized. When a king has no flight squares, the merest check may be fatal. Look for such checks, and especially for open lines leading toward the king on which you might put, say, a bishop. Look for these things and see that bishop moves to d5, check. Almost mates. The trouble is that black's rook on d8 guards the mating square. What to do? Use our current logic. When a rook on the enemy's back rank is frustrating your offensive plans up the board, consider putting one of your heavy pieces, a rook or queen, onto that same rank to threaten his king and overwork his rook. The path for such a piece can be diagonal as well as vertical. Here white does it with queen moves to e8, check. Black is forced to play rook takes queen. Now the coast is clear for white to play bishop moves to d5, check. He mates a move later, after black exhausts a feudal interposition with his rook on e6. At first the queen's move to e8 may seem counterintuitive because you imagine that it is doing important work hemming in black's king. But most of that work is being done by the pawn on g7, and the rest of the job, the sealing of the f7 square, is done by your bishop once it moves to d5. Now, as a quick exercise, consider the consequences of starting here with 1. Bishop moves to d5, check. Well, that works. 2, 1, rook takes bishop, 2, queen moves to e8, check. Knight moves to f8, 3. Queen takes knight, king moves to h7, 4. Queen moves to h8, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? Here is the same position just viewed but with one change, black's queen is on c8. This alters the payoff but not the basic idea. Now after 1. Queen moves to e8, check. Rook takes queen, 2. Bishop moves to d5, check. Black's interposition of his rook on e6 is not quite feudal, for the rook is protected by black's queen. But white still has 3. Bishop takes rook, check. Queen takes bishop, 4. Pawn from f5 takes queen, winning the exchange. The initial move 1. Queen moves to e8 performs the same function as before. It forces black to move his rook out of position so that it can defend against mate only indirectly, by costly interposition, rather than directly, by capturing your bishop. White to move. What is the best move? Again, your inspection of black's king shows it to be tightly constrained. Its only flight squares are on the long dark diagonal, which is almost as good as it having no flight squares at all. Either way, an attack along that diagonal will be a potentially lethal threat. White's queen has the ability to make such a threat, and it's essential to see that there are 2 ways to achieve it: queen moves to c3 and queen moves to e5. Neither move works because both squares are defended, but examine the quality of the protection carefully. Queen moves to c3, check. Is made ineffective by black's rook on c8. We know a way to address this. White puts his rook on d8 with check. Now what is black to do? A. If he plays rook takes rook, white has succeeded in distracting away the guard of c3. He plays queen moves to c3, check. And mates, black has two feudal interpositions which white's queen eats up. b. If black plays queen takes rook, an important possibility to notice, white still wins by using his queen's other route to the long diagonal, queen moves to e5, check. And again he mates after black exhausts an interposition, queen moves to f6. c. Black's king has a flight square and is well advised to use it, in reply to 1. Rook moves to d8, check. He plays king moves to g7 and escapes mate. But then white simply plays rook takes rook. Sometimes, as here, threats meant to overwork a rook on the back rank can end up winning the rook itself, and of course there is nothing wrong with that. You still need to see all the mate threats in play, though, because they are the reason black is forced to forfeit the rook. White to move. What is the best move? By now the vulnerability of black's king in this position should be obvious. It has no flight squares, an attack against it on either of the light squared diagonals leading to its position has mating potential. If white puts his light squared bishop on b5, black stops him by interposing a pawn on c6. So white turns his attention to the other diagonal and the possibility of bishop moves to f7, where the bishop mates but for the black rook guarding the square from h7. Fine, now white has a target in black's rook. He has a way to attack it and take something it protects with queen takes at h5, but to this black can reply pawn from g6 takes queen. So white works backwards and sees that he first needs to get rid of the g6 pawn by taking something it protects. He therefore begins with 1. Rook takes bishop. Black's only recapture is 1. Pawn from g6 takes rook, and now white plays the fork too. Queen takes at h5, check. Notice that the movement of black's g-pawn extended the open line to his king, and mates with bishop moves to f7 next move no matter what black does. E.g., black plays rook takes queen, and then white has 3. Bishop moves to f7, checkmate. Now of course if black sees this coming he will not reply to white's initial rook takes bishop with pawn from g6 takes rook. He will play something like queen moves to d6 or knight moves to d7, refusing to move his pawn on g6. So white wins a piece. Again, however, the fruitful train of thought started with the mating idea and worked backward from it, not because the sequence ended up achieving mate, but because it would have achieved mate if black recaptured every time you captured. It is the threat of mate that forces black to forfeit material in order to stop you. This is another of those positions which could fit comfortably in the next chapter on attacking the guard, but it fits here as well because in the end the black rook is overworked. It protects the mating square f7, but also what turns out to be an alternative mating square for white's queen, h5. White to move. What is the best move? Forking squares and the overworked piece. Sometimes a forking square guarded by an enemy piece can be loosened by taking something else the enemy piece protects, or maybe the other piece it protects can be taken for free, as the enemy concludes that recapturing only results in a more costly fork a move later. We saw lots of examples of this in the chapters on the double attack. Now we can see those studies in fuller context. They all were cases where the guardian of the forking square was overworked. Here are some other examples of how these two concepts, the overworked piece and the double attack, usefully can be combined. With a knight so deep in black's territory, the thought of a fork can't be far from your mind in the position on the left. Here knight moves to e7, check. Suggests itself, but the forking square is guarded by black's rook. Meanwhile you also have a rook on the open file leading to the f8 square next to black's king, and your knight attacks that square as well, so you almost can mate with rook moves to f8. The problem is that f8 is guarded by black's rook. So, your two best offensive prospects both are frustrated by the same enemy piece, suggesting it may be overworked. Try going through with one of the two ideas to see if the other then becomes feasible. Starting with the knight fork doesn't work, for after black replies rook takes knight, white has nothing left. He needed both his knight and rook to mate on f8. But if you start with the mating threat rook moves to f8, check. Black has to reply rook takes rook, and now the fork knight moves to e7, check. Does work, because you only needed the one piece to execute it. You win a queen for a rook. Black to move. What is the best move? Black has a single capture of a piece available, queen takes knight. Obviously it doesn't work because white's knight is guarded by his queen. But at least you see that white's queen is working. Is it protecting anything else? Yes, the queen also is the sole guardian of the bishop on b2. You have nothing you can use to take the bishop, but you inspect your knight moves and see that knight moves to d3 attacks it and also forks the king. How might white reply to this move? A. If he plays queen takes knight he loses his queen to black's rook, so instead he no doubt will move his king. B. If white moves his king to f1, his queen is left overworked. It is the only guard of the knight on f3 and the bishop on b2, both of which now are attacked by black pieces. Thus black plays knight takes bishop, and if white recaptures queen takes knight, black has queen takes knight. C. If white instead responds to knight moves to d3 by moving his king to d1, be alert, he has just walked into the kernel of a discovery on the d file. Now black plays knight moves to f4, discovering check and taking white's queen next move. It is common enough for an enemy piece to guard two others, and for you to attack only one of them, as we find in the initial position here. Throwing an attacker at the other enemy piece, i.e., moving a piece into position to attack white's bishop, usually does not create a crisis for your opponent, because now it's his turn and he can either move one of the two attacked pieces or give it another guard. An exception to this logic arises, however, if you can add an attack to the second piece with a double threat as black did here with his knight fork. Then there is no time for white to move one of the attacked pieces. He has to spend his time saving his king, and after he does that his queen is left overworked. White to move. What is the best move? Do nothing without examining any checks you can give, and if you have active knights, do nothing without inspecting their prospects for forks. In this case either inquiry leads you to knight takes at e6, check. A fork of black's king, queen, and rook. The only trouble is that the forking square is protected by black's bishop on c8. The bishop could be taken out first by your d6 knight, but then black plays queen takes knight and nothing has been accomplished. Now his queen guards e6. So move to the next question, does the c8 bishop protect something else you can take? Its only other protectorate is the pawn on b7, but don't be shy about considering a capture of it. The piece white has for the purpose is his other knight, and he sees that n-pawn from d6 takes at b7 is another fork, this time of black's queen and rook. So this is what he plays, and it wins the exchange, plus a pawn, after black ushers his queen to safety on e7. Black can't play bishop takes knight because he needs his bishop to keep guarding e6 against white's worse forking threat. The black bishop was overworked. It protected two different forking squares. In retrospect you therefore can see that the presence of black's pawn on b7 was unimportant. What made b7 significant was that a fork was available from there, and this would have been no less true, though it might have been a little easier to overlook if b7 had been empty. The point to take away is that a piece can be overworked just as easily by having responsibility for too many forking squares empty or occupied as it can be when it guards too many mating squares or too many pieces or any combination of these things. So while your tactical investigations can begin with a look at any pieces you can capture, they also need to include high awareness of any forks or mating possibilities and how the enemy fends them off. White to move. What is the best move? First see the convergence of the paths of white's queen and rook at h7, where he would mate were it not for the protection supplied to that square by black's queen. One way to interpret this is to say black's queen is frozen on the 7th rank, it can't afford to go any place out of reach of h7, another is to say that white can, by playing rook takes knight, force black's queen over to h7. Both perspectives are accurate, the question is which is more useful. To answer this you need to consider your other offensive options, or near options, and how black's queen bears on them. Perhaps the simplest thing is to imagine black's queen over on h7, for then it's easier to see the triangle between black's king, rook, and f6 pawn and thus a queen fork for white with queen takes at f6, check. Black's queen is revealed to be overworked, it protects the mating square h7, and the knight that sits there, and it also protects the forking square f6. The fork doesn't come into existence until the queen moves out of the way, so rook takes knight rather than queen takes at f6 is the right way for white to begin. There still is a loose end, of course, the rook that is the target of the fork is guarded by the knight on c6. So naturally you start with 1. Bishop takes knight, pawn from b7 takes bishop then 2. Rook takes knight, check. Queen takes rook, 3. Queen takes at f6, check. And 4. Queen takes rook, winning a piece. You also might have seen the idea here by simply examining your checks, queen takes at f6 and rook takes knight. You see that black's queen recaptures in both cases, and this causes you to wonder what happens if you play one of the checks and then the other. White to move. What is the best move? We saw this position in the chapter on capturing the guard. White is considering knight takes at e4, which looks plausible because the pawn is protected once and attacked twice. But in the earlier chapter we saw that black can reply queen takes queen, check. Removing the knight's guard, after white recaptures, black has knight takes knight and wins a piece. Now you can see another refutation for black as well. After white plays knight takes at e4, his knight is guarded by his queen, that is what prevents knight takes knight. Look at what else the white queen protects, or look for any checks black can give, or look for any intriguing visual pattern. The result by any route is queen takes at c3, check. A triangular queen fork that wins the rook on a1. So after white starts with knight takes at e4, black goes ahead with knight takes knight, inviting white to play queen takes knight. If he does, he leaves the forking square loose and black plays queen takes at c3, check. Gaining a rook. White overworked his queen, using it to guard his knight and a forking square. We revisit an earlier point: if you venture a piece out onto the board, perhaps to grab a pawn, and expect it to be safe because one of your pieces will protect it, you must pause to ask not only if the guardian can be taken, but also what else it is supposed to protect, what pieces, and what squares. White to move. What is the best move? Start, as ever, by reconnoitering. What captures do you have the power to make? White's queen threatens the rook on c7. The rook's only guard is the queen on e7. This means the black queen lacks flexibility, which invites you to look for ways to exploit other squares the queen appears to protect. One would be to give check with 1. Knight moves to f6, where white's queen pins the g7 pawn and thus gives the knight a safe berth. If black plays queen takes knight, then of course white has queen takes rook and wins the exchange. But black can avoid that outcome by instead moving his king to h8, so the question is what comes next. Since you just moved your knight, ask whether it has fresh forking prospects. This leads to the charming move 2. Knight moves to e8, attacking the rook on c7 a second time and also creating the startling mate threat queen takes at g7, checkmate. Black can extinguish the threat with queen takes knight, but now comes the much awaited 3. Queen takes rook followed by 4. Queen takes at a7, after black moves his b8 rook up the board, he can't move it to 8 because white's bishop covers the square. White wins the exchange and a pawn. The only variation to worry about occurs after white plays 2. Knight moves to e8. Black doesn't have to play queen takes knight, he can block the mate threat with pawn from g7 moves to g6. But this is much worse for him, because by failing to make a capture on that move he has left his rook on c7 attacked twice and guarded just once. So after white plays 3. Knight takes rook, black dares not recapture. White wins a whole rook, not just the exchange. The trickiest part of the position is seeing the finisher knight moves to e8, as knight moves to an opponent's crowded back rank are not common. The way to ensure that you see such moves is simply to be vigilant in looking for forks anytime your knight is in enemy territory, and re-inspecting for them after any move of the other side's pieces, especially his king.